This move immediately stakes a claim in the center, controlling key squares and opening lines for the queen and king's bishop, setting the stage for dynamic piece play and potential pawn advances. This move mirrors white's central pawn advance, establishing symmetrical control of the d4 and e5 squares and opening lines for the queen and king's bishop, immediately entering classical opening territory. This move, developing the knight towards the center, exerts pressure on black's e5 pawn and prepares to castle, a fundamental opening principle aiming for king safety and piece coordination. Black immediately strikes back at white's central pawn, developing a piece and preparing to castle, which is a sound and active response to the Ruy-Lopez opening's typical setup. This move initiates the Petrov-Defense, a solid opening where white sacrifices a pawn to gain rapid development and central influence. This move defends the attacked knight, continuing development while initiating a common pawn structure known as the Petrov's defense after black's initial knight move. This move, returning the knight to f3, avoids the immediate tactical complications of nxe5 and instead maintains flexibility, allowing for various developing plans. Black recaptures the pawn, challenging white's knight and developing their piece actively in this variation of the Petrov defense. This move reinforces the central pawn, opening lines for development and challenging black's control of the center after the knight capture and recapture. This move reinforces the central pawn chain, contesting the d5 square and preparing to challenge white's central pawn majority. This move, developing the bishop to d3, supports the central pawn and prepares to castle kingside, aiming for king safety and active piece play in this variation of the Philidor defense. This developing move reinforces the central knight, prepares to castle, and aims to break white's pawn control in the center by challenging the d4 pawn. This move develops the queen to a more active square, supporting the central pawn and preparing for potential pawn advances while also connecting the rooks. This move develops the queen to a central square, supporting the knight on e4 and preparing to castle, while also potentially contesting the d-file. Castling on the kingside secures the king and connects the rooks, a standard developmental move that prepares for central pawn play and potential kingside attacks. Black develops a piece actively, pinning the white knight and preparing to contest control of the central light squares. This move reinforces the pawn on e4, prepares for potential pawn advances on the queenside, and supports the knight's position while connecting the rooks. The decision to castle queenside immediately signals an aggressive intent, aiming to launch a kingside pawn storm and engage in a direct confrontation, albeit at the cost of delaying kingside castling and potentially exposing the king to immediate counterplay. This move repositions the rook to the center, creating a more active defensive posture on the e-file and preparing for potential pawn pushes or piece exchanges. This aggressive pawn thrust initiates a thematic struggle characteristic of certain Petrov's defense variations, aiming to disrupt white's center and create counterplay on the kingside. This move develops the bishop to an active diagonal, pressuring the knight on c6 and preparing potential threats against black's kingside if the pawn structure allows for it later. The queen moves to a more active square, connecting the rooks and preparing to challenge white's attacking setup, while also potentially eyeing the e4 pawn. The move qd3 is a logical repositioning, intending to unpin the knight on f3 by freeing the queen from its defensive duty on e2 and preparing for potential central pawn breaks or further piece development. This move strategically removes white's active knight, which was well placed to support a kingside attack, and opens the G file for black's rook. Capturing the bishop on f3 with the queen simplifies the position and removes a key defender of black's kingside, while also opening the D file for potential future rook activity. This move develops the bishop to an active square, eyeing the weakened light squares around the white king and preparing to support a kingside pawn. Advance. This exchange simplifies white's pawn structure and opens the bishop's diagonal, aiming to exploit black's doubled pawns on the C file and potentially attack the king. The capture of the bishop with the B pawn fundamentally alters black's pawn structure, creating doubled pawns on the C file, which will require careful management to avoid becoming a weakness. This move activates the bishop to a more dynamic square, preparing to contest the open C file and potentially exert pressure on white's queenside pawns. After black recaptures on C6, this move aims to activate the rook on the open E file, threatening to double rooks and potentially exploit the weakened pawn structure on the kingside. This exchange resolves the tension around the bishop on C6 and simplifies the position, preparing to exploit the doubled C pawns that black will now possess. Black recaptures the bishop, accepting doubled pawns in exchange for an open C file and increased pressure on white's center. This knight maneuver aims to improve its placement by repositioning to a more active square on D2, preparing for potential future central pawn advances or support on the queenside. This move repositions the rook to an active square, defending the pawn on E6 and preparing to challenge white's control of the central files and potentially support a kingside pawn advance. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, aiming to control the open D file and potentially support pawn breaks or coordinate an attack on black's kingside. This move develops the queen aggressively, aiming to attack white's kingside pawns while also potentially supporting further advances on the kingside. This move repositions the rook to support the central pawn structure and prepare for potential pawn advances on the kingside, while also defending the vulnerable E4 pawn. The knight sacrifice on D2 is a tactical sacrifice aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and open lines for black's rooks and queen, creating potential attacking chances on the kingside. This exchange of queens and rooks simplifies the position and clarifies the pawn structure on white's queenside, creating potential weaknesses for black. This exchange of rooks is strategically sound as it simplifies the position and removes black's powerful rook from the now semi-open E file, creating an opportunity for white to contest the critical central file. This recapture of the queen, 21, qxd2, simplifies the position, trades queens to alleviate black's attacking pressure on the kingside, and maintains white's central pawn majority. The move 21, k7 aims to reposition the queen to a more active square, potentially supporting a future central pawn push or connecting the rooks, while also preparing to defend the weak pawn on c6 if necessary. Moving the king to f1 prepares to defend the g2 pawn and potentially activate the king in the endgame. This move shores up the king's position on the queenside, preparing to connect the rooks and potentially create counterplay with the a-pawn. This move initiates a pawn lever on the queenside, aiming to create space and potentially break open the position for your rook and queen. This move repositions the queen to the powerful h4 square, eyeing the weakened kingside and potentially setting up tactical threats such as a discovered attack on the rook or pressure along the h-file. This move prevents the black queen from potentially infiltrating the kingside on g3 and also prepares to expand on the queenside with a future b5 pawn push. This pawn push aims to create dynamic complications by opening the f-file and potentially attacking white's king. But it also weakens black's kingside pawn structure and could lead to tactical risks. White aims to reactivate the queen, potentially to support a kingside pawn advance or to defend the d2 pawn after black's queenside expansion. This pawn push on g5 aims to create queenside space and potentially attack the white king. But it weakens the kingside pawn structure and opens the h-file for white. This pawn advance aims to disrupt black's kingside pawn structure and create attacking chances on the queenside. This pawn advance aims to create attacking chances on the kingside, potentially opening lines against white's castled position and disrupting white's pawn structure. This decisive pawn sacrifice opens the b-file, aiming to exploit black's vulnerable king and create immediate tactical threats. This move recaptures the piece that was sacrificed to create a passed pawn. But it opens the king to further attacks and allows white's queenside pawns to advance aggressively. This move initiates a decisive attack on the black king, exploiting the compromised pawn structure and aiming to force a mating sequence or significant material gain. The black king must escape the discovered check, and this move allows it to retreat to relative safety while keeping an eye on the central squares. This move forces the black king to move again, preventing it from finding shelter on d7 and continuing white's active pursuit while controlling key central squares. This move aims to centralize the king to safety and prepare for potential counterplay on the queenside. This move forces a capture, potentially leading to an exchange of queens and simplifying the position, which favors white given the superior pawn structure and king safety. The king is actively seeking safety and potentially counterplay on the queenside, but must be wary of further checks and potential mating nets on the kingside. This move forces the black king out into a very exposed position on f6, setting up a decisive tactical sequence to exploit the unprotected king. The king is dangerously exposed on the g5 square, inviting further checks and potential mating attacks from white's queen and rook. This move forces the black king into a perpetual check situation, as any attempt to escape will be met with a further queen check, demonstrating a decisive mating net and a brilliant exploitation of the king's exposed position. This move is a critical attempt to escape the perpetual check by actively moving the king. But it enters a dangerous position where white can deliver further checks and potentially force a draw or even a win. This check forces the black king to retreat further into the center, disrupting its defensive structure and allowing white to maintain attacking pressure. This queen sacrifice is a critical attempt to regain material and simplify, aiming to disrupt white's king safety and potentially exploit the exposed white monarch in the endgame. This move, qxh7+, is a decisive tactical sequence that forces a checkmate or significant material gain by leveraging the exposed black king and the advantage of open lines. Black recaptures the pawn, but the king is still exposed, and the white queen and king are well placed for further attack. This pawn sacrifice opens a powerful attacking line for white's remaining pieces against black's exposed king, aiming to exploit the weakened king safety created by black's aggressive pawn pushes. This move intentionally walks the king into a dangerous position to avoid immediate material loss, hoping to use the king's newfound activity to complicate the game and potentially find counterplay. This move captures a pawn on c7, a double attack on the king and the rook on a8, which has no escape squares, forcing a win of material for white. This pawn move, 36, RB6, aims to activate the rook by bringing it to a more central square on the 6th rank, potentially supporting future pawn advances or creating threats against white's king. This move forces black's king into a perpetual check, securing a draw with the queen and king against black's isolated king. This king move seeks safety by retreating from the direct line of attack, aiming to find a more secure square behind the remaining pawns while potentially preparing to support any newly developed pieces or counterplay. This move forces black's king to a more exposed square, continuing white's attempt to hunt down the king and potentially set up a mating net with the queen. This king walk has reached a critical juncture. Continuing to expose the king offers little compensation and invites further danger from the white queen and rook. This move is a desperate attempt to create mating threats on the king side by sacrificing material, but it overlooks the fundamental defensive resources available to black after the king is exposed. This move seeks to escape the immediate threats posed by white's king's hunt and prepare to potentially consolidate the king's position behind the f-pawn. This check forces the black king back, and if it retreats to g6, white can continue the mating net with qh8, while retreating to h5 allows white to maintain pressure and potentially advance their passed pawn. This move seeks to maintain the queen's active position and potentially create threats against white's king, while also preparing for further pawn pushes on the king side. This move reinforces the central defense with the rook, preparing to recapture the pawn if black attempts to advance the g-pawn further.